Okay, I'd like to welcome you to the TrinityP3 webinar, Unlocking Performance in the Post-Lockdown Era. And this is about creating more marketing value with less budgets specifically. A little housekeeping to start, just so you know, this is going to be a 1 hour broadcast. We will be stopping at 1 o'clock. You can ask questions anytime. We ask you to use the Q&A function. You can either do it identifying yourself or do it anonymously. And just so you know, we are recording this session. It'll be available for download in the future, should you wish to do so. Just maybe wait for a couple more people to arrive. Okay. So I'm Jeremy Taylor. I'm the business director for TrinityP3 in the UK in London. I'll be hosting the meeting today, but we'll be joined in a short while by, well, I'm being joined by Darren Woolley in Sydney. I thought I'd just start off by sketching where we are in the UK right now. The way I've done it, I simply went to take the news headlines from the business news in the beginning of this month. So I just literally took a snapshot, and this is out of the Times business news sections. I guess we all know this, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because the picture is not very cheerful. Just some headlines. So on the payments front, we saw in March of this year, UK households actually repaid almost £4 billion of credit, which is by a long way the largest repayment total since records began. Implication being, of course, they're not spending money. Households are actually paying down debt, which some economists might say is great, but most businesses would say is not that brilliant. Manufacturing, there was a report from the PMI survey, the Purchasing Managers Index, which showed that manufacturing fell at the fastest rate in 28 years of the survey being run. Mortgage approvals, always a good sign of the health economy, is how many mortgages are being approved. We saw in March the lowest total in 7 years, 27% down. We saw credit card spending falling. In March, it's down 0.3%, and it's down a lot more in April. That is the first time that credit card spending has fallen in the UK since records began to be taken. In the car sales market, an astonishing fall, 97.3% year-on-year fall. That apparently is the lowest total of car sales in the UK since 1947. And finally, just to add to the general economic picture, we saw Royal Dutch Shell declaring its dividend for the first time. And for the first time in 75 years, they've actually cut the dividend. So the market's not in a very cheerful state either. So let's talk a little bit about how that affects marketing. Now, we've had some advice coming in from quite a few people in the marketing world. And here's one from Mark Ritson. I figure I'm sure you all know. So Mark Ritson's view is the best marketers will be upping, not cutting their budgets. He says it might be a paradox, but recessionary periods actually provide fertile grounds for marketers to grow their brand's market share if they're prepared to think long term. Next chart, just talk briefly about how the marketing world is reacting to that. So good advice, you might think. And in fact, Marketing Week survey, which ran in April, showed that 7% of marketers are indeed seizing the opportunity to spend more during the crisis. And notably, I think we've seen P&G saying that they are going to be doing exactly that. However, 50% of marketers surveyed said they are seeing cuts being made and they're going to live to fight another day rather than try and fight that battle. And indeed, 1 in 10 of the marketers who were interviewed reported that if they went to the CFO with a request for more money, they would be told where to go in polite terms. 46% reported no cash to invest in increased marketing spend. And WARK ran some forecast indicating that they foresee total UK ad spend declining by 16.7% this year, after it increased after last year was actually an all-time record. They're also seeing some specifics such as TV spending declining by 20% and digital spend decreasing, which is the first time that's happened in 10 years of continuous growth. last of these little quotes, 32% of people from the Marketing Week survey were told that they would have to go and prove the link between marketing investment and return before any consideration would be given. So I guess that gives us a little bit of hope. So having sketched that little piece of background, that kind of gloom in the UK market, what we do know is that life will continue, although it's not a cheerful picture. Life continues, and in fact, we know that most businesses will be looking to marketing to actually generate some growth into that situation. So I'd like to bring in Darren. Darren's in Sydney. He heads up TrinityP3 globally. Darren, you've been around advising companies on their marketing for a number of years, and in fact, you lived through the previous collapse in the great financial crisis, the GFC in 2008, was something you lived through and advised clients through. My question for you, I suppose, is are we seeing a repeat of that situation? Are people going to be doing the same thing this time around, or is there how's it going to react?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and it's terrific to be able to talk to you on this webinar. But I think it's very different this time. You know, last time all we were dealing with was a recession, and I say all we were dealing with. It was primarily economic. It had implications, obviously, for businesses and people. But this time, it's the combination of the pandemic, health issues, the risks associated with that, that's impacting on the economy. You know, we've had a very fragile economy in 2019 coming into this year, and this has actually had a huge impact, not only on people's outlooks, but also, you know, just the ways of doing business. The thing is, what we saw back in 2007, 2008 is, you know, in our role, we had a lot of marketers coming to us and saying, my budgets have been cut by 30 or 40%. Can you help us find a way forward so that we can deliver our marketing plans for 30 or 40% less? And we said, of course we can work through this with you, work out ways of driving greater efficiency and effectiveness. Almost never did that come through to an actual project, because what most marketers did would they turn to their agencies and say, I've got 30% less budget. And the agencies would say, well, as goodwill, we'll do all of the work you want to do, just pay us 30 or 40% less. Now, why could the agencies do that? Well, you know, obviously there was margin in there. Agencies were willing to sacrifice that for the good of the relationships. They saw this as relationship building, and traditionally in advertising, there was a belief that if you look after your client in the hard times, the client would look after you in the good times. It's now 13 years later, 12 to 13 years later, and what we've seen is that while the economy returned to being more positive, the actual agency fees have not returned to being more positive. If anything, there's been a continual downgrading of the investment in advertising. And look, probably the best way to demonstrate that is to actually show you some data that we've collected over that time. So what we have here is we have SMUs, scope metric units, developed by Michael Farmer, who's our partner in the US. And a scope metric unit is a measure of productivity. It's not just the number of projects, but it takes into consideration the number of resources or a unit of resources required to do the work. And what you can see on the left is the price or the fees per scope metric unit of work done by agencies. Michael started this work in the mid-90s when, you know, agencies on average were getting between 350 to 400,000 per scope metric unit. Down to last year, it was down at around $132,000 per scope metric unit. This is US dollars, but the sample is actually a global sample with marketers and advertisers working across multiple markets. On the right is media agencies, and so a media scope metric unit. which we've been working with Michael for the last 5 years, but using our data going back to 2007, you can see media agencies were getting on average around 220,000 per media scope metric unit back in 2007. That's dropped down to just over 90,000 today. So what this demonstrates is over the last 10 to 15 years, a progressive downgrading of the amount invested in agencies for the amount of work that they're actually doing. It's not just in devaluing, it's on the basis of the productivity of the agencies as well. Now, you'd ask yourself, if they're being paid less to produce this work, does that actually impact on their productivity? And you can see here, if we look at the number of creatives, SMUs per creative per year. So this is a measure in creative agencies of the amount of work creative people were doing in agencies. Back in 1992, last century, it was around 2 to 2.5 SMUs per creative in an agency. You can see up to 2018, that's 5.5. This is a phenomenal amount of productivity per creative person in agencies. Creative people are producing more work each year than they were back in the 1990s. Now, what's driving that? One of the key figures that we see is that back in 1995, the average brand would produce between 150 and 200 outputs or pieces of work per year. In 2018, 2019, that figure had jumped to 3,000 to 5,000 pieces of work, and that was being driven by social media and digital media. The amount of collateral required to be produced to fulfill the digital channels is actually absolutely driving the amount of work agencies are doing, at the same time as being paid less for doing that in real terms. So to say, could we go back and do the same thing again this time? Could we get 30% more productivity? Could we get 30% decrease in fees? I would say on these figures, we're pretty much cut to the bone already. And to try and do that would be trying to squeeze blood out of the proverbial stone.
Yeah, in the UK we have a lovely saying that says squeezing till the pits squeak. I think that sounds like where we are. So, interesting data. Kind of showing there's, as you said, not too much opportunity to squeeze more from the agencies. So given that there are, I guess, limited learnings from where we were with GFC, where do we, in your view, where do we need to look now? It sounds like cost savings aren't going to be productive this time around. So is it more about getting more value than just shaving costs? Darren, can you advise on some of that?
Well, I think it's interesting you use the term value, because we're seeing the conversations now happening, especially amongst marketing procurement, of how do we actually drive value? How can we get value? Because I think most marketing procurement people will have started to realise that you can't just keep cutting fees. And I think the approach has to be to start being more strategic in the way that we manage the workflow and the way that the agencies work. And what I mean by that is most people are familiar with a prioritization matrix. It's a decision-making process where you're able to prioritize tasks so that those that have the most impact or deliver the most return or have the most importance get a higher priority than those activities that have less return. And so we see the big opportunity here going forward is for marketers to start formalizing what is often an informal process and start to classify their requirements going forward with their agencies, so that, and I'll show you an example here that we use. This is one where you can see across the top, there's strategic importance. Now, strategic importance could be anything from, brand building or product launches or whatever. That's your strategic importance. And on the side is the financial investment or the return on investment. Primarily what percentage or what part of the budget's going to be invested. And what this means is that whether you're working at a brand basis, and we've done this work with consumer packaged goods, where there's a house of brands. And what we've done is taken all of those brands and first applied this approach to really classify each of the brands as to whether they're tier 1, 2, or 3. And what we mean by that is, whether these brands are going to be strategic, whether they are strategically important and going to give a high return on investment, or whether they're actually of lower importance and or have a lower return on investment. That's if you're doing it on a brand basis. We've also done this with telcos and financial services companies, and we've applied the same matrix to the products and services that are on offer. So, whether it's a bank and its credit cards versus home loans versus savings accounts, whatever the product or service on offer, we're able to then classify those against strategic importance and the return on investment. But you can even take this prioritisation matrix a step further, Jeremy, and start to apply this to things like individual campaigns. Is there a brand building campaign, and how is that different from, say, an acquisition campaign as opposed to a tactical, price off campaign? How do they vary? Now, most marketers would be watching this and saying, well, but I do that anyway. I'm inclined to invest more in my brand building activities, and because it's only on for a short time, the tactical campaigns get less money. And that's absolutely true. The fact is that from an agency's point of view, if you're doing the same outputs, whether it's a brand output or a tactical output, they're often seen as equally important. And they will argue that they will also take the same amount of resources and therefore consume the same amount of agency time and cost. And so we think this approach is actually quite effective as a way of allowing marketers to prioritise those areas that have the most impact for the business or have the most importance, and be able to structure that in the way that they brief their agencies.
It sounds like a powerful weapon, actually. Darren, I wonder if we got any, you've been doing some of this work, I know, around the world, or we've been advising clients globally on this approach. Is there financial evidence that it has an effect?
Well, what we've done is actually, first of all, we've translated this into the pricing model that we've used with agencies. And what I can show you here is an example. This was for a bank. And you can see on the down the left here is a small sample of what was around 400 different outputs. And then across the top, a classification of whether that output was going to be originated, an extension of an existing idea, or an adaptation of existing work. And then under each of those was this idea. They didn't want to call the work tier 1, 2, and 3. So we worked with them to come up with the title hero work, push work, and acquire. And what they meant by that was hero work was building value for the organisation. Push was promoting existing or new products and services. And acquire was primarily, as the word says, acquisition. And whether that was going to be done in an origination, a refresh, or a complex adaptation. And you can see different prices for that work. Now, those prices are actually the agency fees. And so, to give you an idea of how that pans out, that is still only a small sample of the overall pricing model that we put in place. Now, the way it would work is that for each brand or each business unit, they were able to use this and then be able to work through with the agency, whether it was going to be, first of all, hero, push, or acquire, and whether they're going to be originating new work, extending existing work, or adapting existing work. And then work through the media channels to work out which outputs they specifically needed, and know exactly what the agency fee would be to do that. So that's the approach that we used to actually develop a pricing model that was actually aligned not just to the work being done, but the value that that work represented for the brand and the business. Now, and there were some challenges as we've rolled that out, which I can talk about later. But to prove that it actually works, the first thing we found, and we rolled this out across Asia Pacific and parts of EMEA, and just the process of implementing the prioritisation matrix, in most cases saved around 15 to 25%. By eliminating work that the business, the brands would often put through the agency, purely because it was on the plan, the marketing plan, without actually thinking about why it was on the marketing plan. You know, often you can end up with a lot, in this day and age, especially with digital channels, you can end up with a lot of outputs that actually it's hard to justify their existence. So that was the first saving. Then I just want to show you how the second savings works. By then pricing, depending on the value of those, you go to this model here, and this is a very simple financial model. But let's say you're producing 100 outputs for your brand, and that was costing you £1 million. When you then prioritise those, and typically for a consumer packaged goods company, we'd find that actually only about 30% of it, or 30 of those outputs, would be actually tier 1 activities. Around 40 would be tier 2, and another 30 would be tier 3. You're still producing 100 pieces of work, but effectively the agency fee would be £800,000, an additional 20% saving. For telcos or services-based companies, what we found is often tier 1 was only 10% of the work, but tier 2 was often 30%, and tier 3 acquisition was around 60% of the investment. So still 100%, but using this pricing differential based on the tiered approach, you get a 30% saving overall. So this is the way that you can actually use a prioritization matrix to then turn that into a more efficient way of managing and briefing your agencies, and aligning the agencies to the work and the finances to the agencies based on the strategic and financial importance of the work being done.
Okay, so that's pretty powerful financial evidence. And when we talk about getting more impact from less budget, I mean, that's quite powerful stuff. Some questions actually starting to come in. So actually, here's a quick question for you. No matter how much common sense you can talk about the way these things work, there's often a resistance to change, I think, in organizations. Have we found that obstacles come up when this kind of approach starts to be advised? And where is it going to come from, do you think, as this approach is adopted?
Well, it's interesting because we have, every time we've rolled this out, there's usually resistance on both the marketer and the agency side. The first is for marketers. And you can imagine, Jeremy, if you're a brand manager in an organization that has a multitude of brands. So your life is about managing one brand, and yet there could be 100 brands in this organization. From your perspective, your brand is the most important brand there is. So applying a prioritization matrix, and I remember well in Japan, a poor brand manager was sitting there most distraught that their CMO had just applied their brand to the prioritization matrix and made the declaration that this was a tier 3 brand. Now, that's very hard to accept when your life is that brand. Your every day is about how to build that brand. What we needed to do was help the brand manager understand that they were already a tier 3 brand because of the size of the budget that they were being given. You know, in many ways, budgeting and the way budgets are broken up automatically indicate whether a brand is, you know, a high value brand. A tier 1 brand usually will get a large proportion of budget. Whereas a tier 3 brand, they were already getting a small proportion of budget. But what we're able to then point out to them is by being a tier 3 brand would give them access to being able to get their work done without paying the premium that the tier 1 brands may pay. So they're actually getting more bang for their buck. And they could work with the main agency and not pay the main agency fees. Now, on the agency side, the first thing is overcoming a mentality which has been around since the 90s, which is the agency business is not about producing advertising. The agency financial business or financial model is about selling people, renting people out to the client. Because most of the agencies were going, well, how can I reconcile the resources to the fee being paid? And we were explaining to them that, well, we're paying for the value of what the people do, not the cost of what the people cost. And it's a really difficult process because most agency finance systems are working out cost recovery, not actually working out value transactions. So the actual fundamental agency finance model is purely seeing their resources as a cost and trying to recover as much of that cost as possible. And that's a huge hurdle to overcome. Having said that, we have usually, when we've run this process, had the buy-in of the CFO through procurement. And so while there have been these hurdles, in every case, it's been embraced down the track.
Okay, good. It's good to hear. I'm wondering actually, for the agencies beyond the change of financial model, agencies tend to be quite driven by the glory as much as the money in many cases. So if we start talking to agencies about them being in tier 3 rather than tier 1, is there going to be a noses put out of joint here? Is it they might feel a little bit sidelined if they're perceived as being a tier 3 rather than a tier 1?
Look, it's interesting because you have to be, you have to be careful about tier 1, 2, and 3, or gold, silver, bronze, or A, B, and C. Whatever you use as a classification, and that's why the banking client used hero, push, and acquire. Because they're words that didn't. I still think hero has got a sense of aspiration to it, but they were words that were less focused on a perception of good, better, best, or good, not so good, and not great at all. But what it's actually about is aligning the value of the work to the remuneration. Now, what drives the value? How important it is for the business, how important it is for the client. Not everything an agency is asked to do and is equally important. There are some pieces that are, let's call it collateral production, and others that are really big strategic drivers. And yet the idea that you get paid the same amount, the same rate, whether you're working on something that's a big strategic driver or a piece of collateral, is just crazy. It doesn't make sense. Now, a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking, all right, so I put all my tier 1 work with an expensive agency and I put all my tier 3 work with a cheaper agency. That's not true at all. In fact, a conversation I had when I took a CEO of a large agency in the US through this model, they went, this is brilliant, because a lot of their very large clients had been taking away that what we call tier 2 and 3 work away from the agency because the agency was perceived as being too expensive. They were taking away the large volume of collateral and acquisition work and handing that to a cheaper agency, or taking it in-house where they perceived that they were getting a cheaper execution. Now, this would allow that large agency to be able to meet the financial expectations of that client, to ward off the competition that are offering a lower cost solution, and actually have a control or influence over all of the client's work for that brand. So it can actually work for agencies because what it's doing is providing an alignment of the client's expectations and budgets to the work that's been asked by the agency to do.
Yeah.
It's an example, but a great example is, in Seoul, I had an account director say, oh, well, we'll just get all the juniors to do the tier 3 work. And I said, well, you could do that, but it seems quite short-sighted to me because, in fact, your more senior creative people and strategists will rip through that work very quickly because they're experienced. If I was going to use junior people, I'd be using them to come up with lots of ideas under the purview of your senior team on the tier 1 work where you've got money to invest there.
Yeah. So I was thinking as you're talking, so agencies shouldn't just look at this and think, oh, here's another big stick to beat me with, and this is an opportunity for them to work in a different way, maybe.
And not just work in a different way, but also work in a way that's more aligned to the expectations of the client. I mean, you asked before about some of the obstacles. One of the big imposts this has is on the marketers to actually stop thinking about their requirements of the marketing plan as a list of things to get done by the agency and start to categorize those pieces and also work with the agency to find more efficient and effective combinations of those things. Instead of every year briefing in originating a new TV campaign, for instance, to think about, well, can we actually take last year's campaign and extend it, or even take last year's ad and do a refresh or an adaptation of it as a way of putting more money back into things like media, or into other channel executions that will help bolster the overall reach and frequency of the communication. So it gives you a framework to have those conversations about how to take what's going to be increasingly a smaller and smaller budget and actually discuss it with the agency on the options, creatively, production and otherwise, of making that investment go much further to achieve the brand objectives.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that an output-based model actually might help marketing teams beyond just cost control. There are other benefits that they can that might come to the marketing department as well as the way the agency works.
Absolutely, and going back to my brand manager in Tokyo, for them, we would say if you're classifying your brands in a house of brands or a branded house, you would need to revisit that every 12 months because, a brand that in 1 year is tier 3 or another one that's tier 1, the following year could easily have changed the priority. So you need to, and that would be a very tangible recognition of the changes, either improvement or otherwise, of those brands year on year.
Do you think, we're talking about all this in the context of COVID-19 and pandemics and lockdowns and grim economic news. Is this something which should be happening anyway, or is this something which is being driven by this new world we're coming into?
Look, I think this pandemic has accelerated the need for change. We've seen in the last 12 years an ongoing downward pressure on agency fees. And, in fact, I've got it here, Michael Farmer's book, Madison Avenue Manslaughter, really details the implications of that downward pressure. We've seen agencies increasingly juniorize staff. They're letting go the more senior experienced people because the business model can no longer afford it. All of these implications are there, but people are hanging on to the old model. Agencies are still often wanting to be paid on a cost recovery basis rather than exploring these new areas. I think the huge amount of disruption that we've seen in the last 2 months is going to make people more open to consider different models. Now, we've been implementing this model since, well, around 2010. We've been rolling this out across a number of clients. But I would have to say that there has been as much resistance as there has uptake, and that perhaps this resistance will be diminished by the fact that people are going to have to find other ways of doing more with less. You know, your introduction is that the only way, hopefully, out of this is up. And up is going to require marketers doing more with less. So how can we move forward on that? We can't do it on the basis of just paying agencies less for cheaper people. What we need to do is find new ways of investing in the parts of the work that agencies do that drives value, drives growth, drives strategic importance, and decrease the investment in the areas that are perhaps not as effective at driving that. So I think, yeah, COVID-19 is going to disrupt a lot of things. I think it'll accelerate change. The fact that you know, people are working from home and using video conferencing is going to be a big change. It'll be interesting to see if it has the same big change on the way agencies are actually remunerated.
Yeah. Here's a little question that's just coming in. So, sorry, specifically, is prioritization, is that helping? I'm thinking of hearing that it's helping marketers to make better decisions. Are you finding that with the, and is there any evidence of the kind of improved decision making that can come from prioritization?
Well, in actual fact, a lot of marketers prioritize things on the run. You know, when you're putting together your marketing plan, when you're distributing your budget or working out your budget, you've already got a prioritization process happening there. But what happens is that, you know, very few marketers get to execute their marketing plan exactly how they developed it prior to budgeting. You know, either the budget comes back less, or the market circumstances change, or there's a business requirement. So things are always changing. The trouble is that the same approach of prioritization that you used in the budgeting process and the planning process often falls to bits during those rapid changes. So what we see here is by formalizing a prioritization matrix, whether it's a brand level, a product and service level, a campaign level, or even a channel level, means that everyone has got the same framework to work to. It means that the marketers, the framework that they use to develop their marketing plan goes all the way through, and it aligns the agencies to their expectations. Now, when a change happens, what do? You go straight back to the prioritization matrix and work out how to deal with the change. Is this a tier 1 issue? Is it a tier 2 priority, or is it a tier 3 priority? And what's the implication for the cost of doing that, and therefore the amount that needs to be invested? So, you know, let's use COVID-19. In the last 2 months, we've seen brands have to pivot very quickly in the way that they've communicated with their agencies. With their consumers through the agencies, right? And in fact, there's quite a good video on YouTube that says almost all COVID-19 brand ads look exactly the same. Now, the question would be, Mark Ritson wrote that none of this advertising will have any impact whatsoever. But it'll be interesting to see, sitting inside the organisation, did that suddenly become a priority one purely because of the size of the problem externally? Or if you'd applied it to through a prioritization matrix, would you have realized that it's actually priority 2 or priority 3? You know, rather than just reacting, it gives you a framework that allows you to take control and have some way of managing your response in those circumstances.
So this could be quite a big culture change in the way in which marketing departments and agencies both work. Um, is this something you just sort of pick up and stick in place, or is there a period of bedding in? What's the kind of experience of a shift from the old model to new?
Well, the answer to the first statement is absolutely. This is a big shift.
Yeah.
Because what it's doing is starting changing a relationship to the way it often was in the past, which is having the agency and the client having a conversation around this framework that is as equal partners. You know, the agency can have a greater input into the combinations or the application of the framework. We don't just go in and say, here's the output-based model, go for it. What we do is the first thing we look at is the volume of scope of work, the diversity of scope of work. We look at the current productivity of the brands with the agencies. And what we've found, for instance, again, in a house of brands, a very traditional consumer packaged goods arrangement, that some brands are much more efficient in the way they work with their agencies than others. And we have to build that in. We have to accommodate the different ways of working within organisations and agencies, because the baseline is to start working out, well, what is the cost, but then move from cost to value in the pricing model. So we often start off by looking at how well and how efficient is this relationship currently working, so that we then get a baseline that we can start developing a value-based pricing model from.
Here's a good question. What do you do with those projects that just have to be done because the CEO or the chairman says so? Your JFDI ones. Is that in a matrix, or is that something that it's elsewhere?
Well, we often say if the chairman or the CEO wants to do it, that would give it high strategic importance. But if there is no return on investment, that would bring the importance down from tier 1 to tier 2, and you could possibly argue even tier 3. So that's where the interesting thing about that prioritisation matrix is people go, well, what do you mean by strategic importance? And this is another advantage that I didn't mention earlier, which is strategic importance could be anything from how important it is to the business, how important it is to the purpose of the business. You know, if you're in an organisation where environmental sustainability or social responsibility are high on the agenda, then that would be sitting on that strategic importance. Projects that actually drive those agendas and those strategies become more important. So you can actually apply it. And in fact, we have seen that in that a brand that was using a pricing matrix was able to then talk to the agency and go, look, we know this is for the office of the CEO. The CEO thinks it's very important, but from a marketing perspective and the interests of the brand, it's tier 2.
Yep. Okay. When you start talking to clients and agencies about this new way of doing things, do you get a reaction that people say, well, we're doing that already, or is this something which they maybe they're saying that but not actually doing it? Have you found that there are kind of claims of it being in place but not being implemented properly?
Oh, absolutely. Because as I mentioned before, you know, a lot of people think that they're adding a prioritization in their decision making. You know, I've got 2 projects, this one's more important. So, you know, and what we often find is that the amount of time spent on a more high priority project will be higher than the actual amount invested. You know, the example, the financial model I gave you before, it's really interesting when we sit down and we're talking to the senior marketing team and we'll say, well, how much do you think you invest in brand? Oh, 40 or 50%. And how much do you spend in acquisition? Oh, 30%. And then when we actually do the analysis of the spend, It's more like 10 to 20% of brand work. And the vast majority, 60 or 70%, is going to be for acquisition. Now, why is that so? Why does the perception and the financial reality differ? Because often the brand work is a single piece of work that has so much attention and time and effort put into it. And yet the acquisition work could be hundreds, if not thousands, of little campaigns that consume huge amounts of financial resource. But because they're happening all the time, there's no perception of spending a lot of time on them. So that's why the savings of this approach, the savings that are actually delivered, or the ability to reprioritize, actually comes about by making sure that you're not overspending in the large volume, so that you can invest more in the things that are actually smaller volume but more strategically important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So I'd say the difference is what people perceive and what's reality. And unfortunately, like most aspects of life, the two can be very different.
I think we see that in many places, don't we?
Yeah.
We started off talking a little bit about the reaction that marketing people are getting when they go to their CFO and say, "I'm thinking, here's his request for more money," and getting thrown out of the office. Who in the organisation is going to be? Do we think is going to be the chief champion of this kind of approach? Is it sitting with marketing? Is it with procurement? I mean, CFOs might like it. Is it higher? Is the CEO going to be behind this kind of approach?
We've almost exclusively been engaged, usually by marketing procurement or marketing services or marketing finance, marketing operations, is usually where the conversation starts. It's usually driven by a decision made by the CFO and the CEO around their marketing investment and wanting to look at ways of reducing that. Because of what's perceived as being either waste or being ineffectual. The procurement person has realised that you can't achieve that just by cutting the agency's fee, that there needs to be a greater level of analysis into what is the agency actually producing. And so that's where this conversation starts is, well, I know your agenda set to you by the CFO is to reduce the marketing cost, but just cutting it will often end up in this day and age, you pay less, you'll get less. Yeah. Why don't we look at where are the opportunities of actually improving productivity, and improving productivity by identifying where there may be small levels of overinvestment and other areas where there's underinvestment. You know, one of the key areas is that there's a belief that, you know, the effectiveness of marketing is no longer proven or questionable, and yet when you look at all the studies done, the fact is that marketing budget has been moving away from long-term brand building into more tactical and reactive short-term performance marketing. You know, this will actually help balance that.
Yeah, the other point that came up in the Marketing Week survey was that people are being asked to demonstrate return on investment on their marketing budget. Is this kind of approach going to help with demonstrating return, do you think?
Well, the prioritisation matrix, one of the axes is the projected return on investment. Yeah. You know, it has to be part of the consideration. And the argument would be, well, you know, how can I get a return on investment for brand? Of course, you can calculate return on investment for brand building. It's just a longer term window, you know, and that's what Benet and Field are saying, is that think of it as a 2 to 3 year return on investment, not a 2 to 3 week return on investment. But you can still build that in, either as financial or strategic are the two parameters that we use to set that prioritisation matrix.
Talking of timescales, how long typically does it take to get a marketing team and in fact the whole agency roster, I guess, from the start to end of this process, once it's been adopted by the organisation? How long would it take to get it all set up and running?
Look, it's not a fast process. I have to be honest, because and especially if, you know, we're often dealing with multiple markets and multiple agencies in multiple markets. So typically this could be six to 12 months of work to develop and implement and embed. Having said that, we've also been very small, you know, single markets with a single agency. We've managed to turn that around in 3 months. But there is still the need to refine and tweak and revisit that as part of your annual reviews with your agencies, to look for areas that, you know, parts of the pricing matrix have to be adjusted. And also, you know, as I said, every year you need to look at your prioritisation matrix and just see how that applies, whether that's still relevant and how that applies for your brands or for your products or services.
Yeah, I guess actually more often than that in many cases too. Do we find that agencies are looking to provide services across all 3 tiers on an individual agency basis, or do they kind of start to identify their own strengths and stick to one particular area of responsibility in one tier?
It's a really good question, because especially in a world where a lot of brands are building in-house agencies, what we find is that the in-house agency starts to take certain parts of the tier 2 and tier 3 work, whereas traditionally they'll leave tier 1 for the external agency. That's one solution. As I said before, the really smart external agencies start to say, well, we can actually handle all 3 tiers. We will build processes and lines of business to actually deliver all of your needs, but they'll be on different price bases, so that we can meet those needs without an overall diminishing of the quality of the work. Because what we have seen, and it's interesting, because without this very disciplined approach from both the marketers and their agency, what can often happen is the more you do tier 3 type work through an agency, the overall quality or focus can also be dragged down simply by a perception that tier 3 is not good work.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're talking. We're not talking about whether it's good, better, or best. We're talking about agencies producing the work within the parameters of the budget or the price that defines the importance of that work.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier about the assumption that you put more senior people on more impactful work or more strategic work, and more junior people on the other end. But you're, I think, in agreement with that as a necessity.
Well, you know, I'm going to go back to last century when I was a creative director. And it's really interesting when you look at senior teams, they get to solutions much faster purely because of their experience. Whereas junior teams will often explore lots and lots of areas and take lots of time to do it, purely because they don't have that discipline of being able to self-filter yet, or the experience of self-filtering their ideas. So I think it's about matching, you know, horses for courses.
Yep. Darren, I think we are approaching the end of our hour. In fact, we are. We're into our last 3 or 4 minutes. Should we try and wrap up? Maybe just to summarise where we've been for the last hour.
Sure.
I can ask you to have a look at that.
So look, you know, Jeremy, great introduction, where marketing needs to do more with less. You know, we're seeing budgets are hugely under pressure. Business is, you know, all indications are we're heading into what's going to look like a global recession again, driven by this pandemic. So, but the way out of it and the way forward is going to be marketing, driving demand and getting businesses moving. Now, the supply chain's already been squeezed. For the last 10 to 12 years, we've seen this downward pressure, and hopefully the data that I showed you earlier shows that. So how do we do it? The prioritization matrix gives access to formalizing an approach to be able to invest in the areas that are most important, and derive savings in the area that are less strategically important or drive less financial performance. And that can be applied at a brand level, a product or service level, a project level, or even applied to the channels and outputs that you're asking the agency to do. The first thing is then aligning your suppliers to this tiered approach for them to understand that tier 1, 2, and 3 is not about quality, but is about strategic and financial importance. And then to implement a pricing structure that reinforces and supports that by paying a price that reflects the strategic and financial importance of that work. That's the overall message that I wanted to share today.
That's great, and it's really good to get a global view of what's going on in the world and the kind of solutions that are being successfully used all around in different markets. So thank you for all that, Darren. It's been really interesting and really great to hear. I'd like to thank everyone who's been listening in, and thanks for your questions. I hope that you've learned something today during the course of the last hour. As a closing point on your screen, you'll see it now, that this has been recorded, and recordings of the workshop will be available soon. We will let you know. If you haven't already subscribed, please do subscribe at the TrinityP3 site. There's some great articles consistently being published and good stuff to read and to hear about. We do some very good podcasts very regularly too. Do get in touch. There are some addresses there on the screen for you now in London and elsewhere in the world, in Sydney, Singapore. And once again, thanks very much for attending. Hope you found it thought-provoking and interesting. And we'll look forward to talking to you again soon, I hope.